Hello and welcome to BreakPoint 2021. This is Jay Dave, your host for Stage 2. I'm super excited for what we have in store for you today and tomorrow. You know, last year we organized our first virtual conference, over 10,000 registered, 3,000 attended across 150 countries. From the feedback we got, one thing was clear: we need more of these. So we're back, the second edition of BreakPoint. We've stacked up a lineup across 2 days with 15 talks, one expert panel, and a whole lot of learning on all things testing. We'll be hearing from open source maintainers, QA and engineering leaders from world-class teams like Google, HubSpot, Expedia, Canva, Pinterest, and Test Cafe. They'll showcase their greatest work, their latest and greatest work, their playbooks, how they're solving common challenges while building, implementing, and scaling testing practices. We'll cover topics like end-to-end testing, shift left, building a culture of quality using AI, visual testing, and much more. Today we have 8 talks lined up for the day. Here's what the schedule looks like. Right up next, at this stage, we'll have Lamberto, who will be talking about HubSpot's journey in making front-end testing a first-class citizen. In parallel, on stage 1, we have a talk by Rotem, who will be talking about detox and implementing it successfully at Wix. Next, we'll have parallel sessions again on WebDriver BiDi and Shift Left. And session 6 and 7 will also be parallel sessions on Agile testing toolkits and Test Cafe. And the final talk of the day will be on stage 1 on visual regression testing. Now, before we start today's session, I'm going to quickly run through a few tips on how to use Hopin, the UI. You'll see 3 options on the left. There's reception, stages, and expo. Reception is where you'll find all the general information you need, which talks are live right now, key announcements, and the full schedule for you to explore and add to your calendar. The second option under that is stages. You can use it to enter live talks, see what's upcoming, and switch between stages. The third option is Expo. We've set up virtual booths where you can come talk to solution experts from BrowserStack about your testing needs and challenges. Come say hi and enter for a chance to win BreakPoint swag. Now, on the right side, you'll see 2 options, event and stage. Make sure to use the stage tab during all talks while you're interacting. Use the chat option under stage to ask all your questions to the speaker. We'll have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of each talk where we'll take questions from the chat. Next is the poll option under the stage. We'll be announcing a few polls throughout the session. You can participate using this option. Under event, there's also an option called people. This allows you to find fellow attendees and network with them. You can send messages and set up meetings. We highly encourage you to use the chat to introduce yourself, ask great questions, and virtually meet your fellow attendees. Lastly, we are recording all sessions of BreakPoint, and we'll be publishing them. Now, with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to Lamberto Fichera, Technical Lead at HubSpot. Lamberto is an experienced engineer specialized in building UI testing infrastructure used by hundreds of development teams. He speaks JS fluently with a thick ES6 accent, loves web technologies, solving challenging problems, and most of all, pizza, which we can all agree on. When he's not typing on a keyboard, he can be found at the racetrack riding sport bikes. Today, Lamberto will be sharing his journey of making front-end testing a first-class citizen at HubSpot by building a testing infrastructure team whose sole mission is to empower engineers to build more reliable products. Join me in giving Lamberto a warm welcome in the chat. Over to you, Lamberto. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you, Jay. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Lamberto. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we made front-end testing a first-class citizen in our organization. But just before that, a little introduction about myself. Well, Jay already covered it, so just a very, very quick slide here. I'm the tech lead of the front-end testing infrastructure at HubSpot. I've been with the company for about 3.5 years. And I really do love pizza. I thought that was relevant to say. And I also love testing, by the way. I've about 10 years of engineering experience, and I'm from Italy, and I live in Ireland for about 5.5 years. All right, so today we're going to talk about why you may need a front-end testing infrastructure team, or why you may not. front-end testing at HubSpot, so how we tackled this problem and what we did to make testing a first-class citizen, and then a few more practical examples of improvements and enhancements to our infrastructure that we built over the years. All right, so first and foremost, why do you need a testing infrastructure team? Well, the answer might seem simple. Testing is hard. Flaky tests is generally a word that's very well known in this topic. So we might just call it off with the with the whole talk and just say, yeah, testing is hard. You need an infra team. But I just wanted to give a little more information on the why we did it and what are the problems that we've seen in the past and how we fix them. So yes, testing is hard, but why? First of all, it's really resource intensive, and that it's
Hey folks, looks like Lamberto may be experiencing some technical difficulties. Just give him a moment to join back in.
okay.
Welcome back, Lamberto.
Can you hear me? I hope so.
Yep.
Apologies for the freeze. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead. Hopefully everything is back. All right, so, all right, I was gonna say, so testing is hard. It's resource intensive. It requires time to write tests, time to run tests, and time to debug tests. Speaking of debugging tests, that is another major issue because generally when you're running through a debugging session of your acceptance tests or your end-to-end tests, you're hopping into multiple layers in your asynchronous code, and that is because end-to-end testing is asynchronous by nature, and this is generally not the most straightforward task to get down to the root cause of the problem of the test failure. It's also a matter of timeouts. So sometimes you just have those tests that fail with no apparent reason, and the error message is very cryptic. It just shows you some random message saying that the browser has been inactive for such and such minutes, and this makes root causing the issue even more complicated. The third thing is that generally there is a steep learning curve, obviously. So that depends on the framework. We use Selenium at HubSpot, but also I know many other frameworks also share some of the concerns, some of the complications of Selenium. And in addition to that, there is also in addition to that, there's also the fact that the browser itself is complicated to test because there's animations, there is network requests, there is connectivity drops, there is all of these things that can affect your tests. So generally, what the situation at HubSpot many years ago was a bunch of driver.sleep just to make your test pass, and that was the number one thing that we tackled was trying to develop the mindset that relying on the sleep is not really what's going to give you reliable tests, because generally these timeouts that you put in there are almost never going to work, and then inevitably you just end up bumping those numbers, and you keep going until it breaks again, and that's not good. Right. The other issue is what should you even test? Is it okay to test everything? Can you do that? Is it practical enough to have a very comprehensive test suite which goes through the entire app, and for every single page it just runs expectations on every single component of it. I've seen many tests doing this kind of basically replicating what a unit test or an integration test should be doing, and generally it's much cheaper to do that on a unit test level, and you might want to leave the end-to-end tests for covering larger workflows and multi-page layouts, and basically more focusing on the user interaction from end to end, and not specifically going to address the individual rendering components. Also, where to test is another problem, because sometimes you want to test on as many places as possible on browsers. You want to be sure that your app is working on every different browser, and sometimes this is not really easy. We all know that Internet Explorer 11 is not the most easy to work with kind of browser, and especially so in testing. We do support that browser still in the HubSpot product, so we have to test on it as well. Right, so all of these are some of the main reasons why you might want to address testing on an infrastructure level. Speaking of front end at HubSpot, we basically, just to adapt to the considerations, we have around 500 different micro apps and 500 different libraries, and about 200 developers are working on those apps. So all of them work and look and feel the same, because we have a common infrastructure at the end, at the bottom of it. But they are all different apps. So all the teams have their own tests, and they take care of testing their own apps from a unit testing perspective and from an end-to-end testing perspective. So yeah, just to sum up what we said so far, why do you need a testing team? So this is to avoid teams to reinvent the wheel. So if you have a variety of those small autonomous teams all writing their own tests, you really don't want them to having to code again the same things, especially if they're using the same components, the same things all over the place. And you also want to abstract away complexity, the low-level complexity from them, so that the engineers can really focus on just writing, just covering their own apps, the micro app that they work on. And it's basically also a good way to spread best practices. It's really easy to start on the wrong foot with testing, and then it takes a good few iterations to correct those mistakes and actually find the best practice and share the best practices in your organization. Especially the more you grow, the more that's true. So that is another important piece for a testing team. Ultimately, also, a testing team owns. It's all about ownership as well, because if a new framework comes up and it's all of a sudden just it's really I don't know, the mood of the moment, and it's really better, it's easy to get into the situation where some teams are using the new technologies, some teams are not, and this creates inconsistency, and overall it's not as productive. It doesn't make your engineers as productive as they would be if they could rely on a testing team to own those decisions and to create the guidelines to use those new frameworks, for example. Not just frameworks, but also everything. The browsers where you run your tests on, obviously with some nuances, because some teams might be more working on an app that's just not supported in IE 11, for example. We are in that situation. So there's always some exceptions, but generally the decisions would be centralized. Right, so speaking of front-end testing at HubSpot, as I said, so we have this common layer on top of which all of the apps work, and some of them also create their own libraries, and then they work on top of those. So there is kind of a multi-block system, and then obviously there is the existing frameworks and technologies. Speaking of testing, obviously Selenium comes to mind because that's the one that we've been using for a while. So this keeps the developers as productive and efficient as possible in continuously creating value for our customers, and also helps those small autonomous teams to operate together. It's the front-end platform that we built at HubSpot is made of a few different teams. Testing team is one of them. Obviously, it's kind of the last one that was created in 2018. We also have the core infrastructure team, the UI components team, the I18N team, the performance team. So everyone is dedicated to a specific area of front-end development. So overall, it's about a little less than 30 people working in the front-end platform. And we also go by the name of front-end as a service, which is abbreviated in FAS. That gave us a great chance to come up with a great name that we thought was funny. So the testing team is the Fasttest team. Yeah, that was just kind of a joke. And overall, the goal of the front-end platform is to empower engineers to ship consistent, reliable, and performant user experience. And that is especially true once you start having scaling issues. So you start having a lot of different teams, and you want all of those to work in a cohesive manner. Where the testing team in particular focuses on is the reliability aspect of it. So everything we do, our main goal is to make sure that the final product is reliable for our customers. Right, just a little mention on the workflow that we have at HubSpot for running these tests. So there is everything obviously starts from a pull request. I'm going to go fast on this. It's only just to set the environment for what's coming next. So pull request generally is where everything starts. You ideally would have run your local tests locally, but that is something that sometimes doesn't really happen, and that is why you want to run tests against pull requests, obviously. And then we have a deploy to QA phase, where here it's kind of simplified by saying deploying to QA, but we have different QA stages. Overall, the concept is the same for all of them. So this deploy can be automatic or manual. We're actually in the process of pushing more and more towards automation and towards making the whole continuous deployment a real thing. And that is an ongoing initiative across the company. But generally speaking, you can distinguish those phases in deploy to QA, the test against the QA version of your app, deploy to prod if everything goes right, and then test against the prod. So kind of the typical workflow there. In addition, we also schedule tests. So we run them on a schedule, both on QA and prod, and that is to make sure that change in the APIs, for example, or change in an external system that your app interacts with doesn't cause any downtimes. Right. So going back to the Fasttest team. This is the amazing team of engineers that I work with, Rob, Bastian, and Kevin. So we're all based in Dublin, and the main responsibilities of the team are building those abstractions layers between either the browsers and the test, or also between the common components and the test, supporting, giving not only documentation, but also talks and brown bag sessions, and being actively working with the rest of the engineers to develop that testing mindset across the board, and also staying up to date with the latest in testing. Just a little bit on the testing stack that we use. I mentioned Selenium WebDriver. Actually, I mentioned Selenium, and particularly we use the Selenium WebDriver framework, and we do use the JavaScript bindings through Node.js. that just seemed the best programming language for us, because we were coming from front-end development world. Actually, pretty much everyone in the team moved from a product app into the platform team. And basically, we just wanted to continue using that know-how. And we use Mocha as a test runner. We run everything in a Docker container, and then we use external browser grids like BrowserStack. And we also use Percy for visual regression. And we also built our own browsers grid for Chrome. Right, so browser support. Yes, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, IE, and Safari are basically the main ones and the supported browsers that we have, and we want to cover them all. Generally, we have a minimum requirement of Google, Chrome, Firefox, and IE or Edge to be covered, at least the three of them, simply because testing those provide a comprehensive enough safety net against browser differences, and in cases where your resources are limited and you can have tests running literally everywhere, that's a good compromise. Right, so in terms of building the abstraction layer, just to give more of a practical example, this means going from the left side of these slides to the right side of these slides. So this is kind of simplified, but it's on a high level, this is what's happening. Instead of having the specific team specifying all the different details about which version of the browsers, which server, the credentials, shutting down the session, we centralize everything in a common helper, so that everyone just have to use that function and then run their tests in an easy way. Just focus on the test itself and not on the setting up of it. This improves reusability, gives us the chance to, for example, move from one version to another of a certain browser. And it also makes it easier to identify some trends, because we can do some logging in those common places like the create session in this slide. I mentioned the UI components team. They build a comprehensive set of reusable components for the product. So basically every team uses those components, and as a result, it was only natural to provide a similar thing for testing. So, for example, if you're trying to test a select component, generally you would have something like this. So you would select the trigger element of your select. You would wait for the options to appear. Most likely there's an animation, or at least in our case, there are animations. So you would wait for those to complete, and then you would click on the option, and then you would wait for the staleness of the pop-up. So that is only a simple case. If we go for a more complex case where there's filtering involved and there's groupings and there's multiple selections allowed, everything becomes very complicated. So at that point, that's where the beauty of having a library of Selenium utils helps. You can simply just delegate to the testing team that builds those, select options, for example, just passing the root component, passing a way to select the option, so by value or by index or by text, and then the option itself or the options themselves if it's multiple. You can also filter, and of course, you don't need a front-end testing team to create these utils, and that is actually how the team started in HubSpot. We created these utils as a side project. A few teams got together and they decided to create these reusable components. And this wasn't part of the front-end platform yet back then. And that's when we got the interest from the front-end platform, and we basically became part of that platform. So the point of having this responsibility onto a front-end platform rather than a set of teams is that the ownership that comes from it, the support that comes from it. So whenever there is an issue with these utils, there is one team that's responsible for them. And obviously, over time, we built matching utils for all of the components, or most of the components. So dialogues, accordions, date pickers, options, select page, paginators, pretty much everything you can think of. This is not an exhaustive list. Okay, so components, libraries is probably the main thing that got us started. We also took care of the documentation, as I was saying before. That is one of the ways you can spread the knowledge and the best practices. And this generally, in our case, we have three different areas of this documentation. We have the API docs, just plain old JS doc style kind of documentation for all of those utils that you saw. We have sort of a getting started section where things are more geared towards new joiners or whoever is new at testing, or in general, if you're starting with a brand new test suite and you just want to freshen up your memory, refresh your memory on how to even start that test suite. These are good ways. And then there's also some specific use cases. For example, best practices and patterns on things that are notoriously difficult to test. For example, dialogues, animation that are full of animations, iframes, these kind of use cases. So for those, we have a dedicated section. The other aspect I mentioned is support. Of course, once you start spreading the knowledge, more and more tests are going to be written, and more people are going to have questions around how or why something is not working, or how to test a particular scenario. So we have a testing channel, and this is for everyone really to share ask questions and share knowledge. But it's also a good centralized place for us to provide help and to improve that knowledge and increase that knowledge around testing. All right, so moving on to the final part of the presentation, I want to show some of the improvements that we've made over time to the testing infrastructure. First one we did, or one of the first ones we did, was kind of a no-brainer. By the way, we use the words acceptance tests and the words end-to-end tests interchangeably. They're kind of synonyms for us. That's not true everywhere, but that is kind of how we deal with it. So we call it the acceptance test generator. So this is just a CLI that generates a test package, which has the Selenium utils, which has the all of the bits that we built over time, everything you need, so that you don't have to just copy paste from a different test, from an existing test. Centralized browsers definition. This is, again, kind of a no-brainer. Instead of having everyone specify their own options, we provide a default browsers helper, which just returns all the browsers that we consider the default to run on. Obviously, you can customize that, but generally that should be the exception rather than the norm. And the helper that we built on top of it is the each browser, which is the entry point to all of our tests. So this just takes care of running and creating a session, a BrowserStack session, or an internal session if we're on Chrome, for the browsers that you pass. So if you pass the default browsers, it's gonna just run those tests against all of the run all of the tests against the browsers. And it's also going to do it in parallel if the option is specified. Another option, another helper that we built over time is the login pass-through, as we call it, which is basically a way to log into the product without having to hard code credentials anywhere. We worked with a number of other platform teams to have a leasing user credential leasing mechanism, so we can ask for those during the test. And generally, we advise people to use setup methods before and tear down methods after. Obviously, there is some level of automation in the tear down phase, so we take care of most of it. But that's that allows people not having to worry about doing the login. This is also a faster way to log in because it's cookie based. We just inject the cookie for the login, and it doesn't really involve typing, which is generally something that's a little slow on, especially on IE. It also is a chance for you to specify any environment flags. For us, environment flags would be some flags that allow you to shape how the app looks and feel, some generic flags that work across all of the apps. And then another feature that we built over time is what we call the health check. It's basically a lazy smoke test, a lazy way to create smoke tests. This doesn't require any coding at all. You just specify the routes that need to be tested, and for those routes, sometimes there are some placeholders. If you're using React Router, this is integrated into that, and it just reads those definitions and it tries to test against all of those in the main browser, in the default browsers. Obviously, there are some more advanced scenarios where you would have query string parameters, or the route is defined, but it's got some dynamic route variables, route params that you need to inject. So you can provide those in a configuration file or at runtime with a dedicated script. So this is kind of an easy way to get on board with testing when, for example, you still don't have a full comprehensive test suite that runs across all browsers, and this was an important feature for us, especially in the early stage. Putting more things together, at some point we realized that we had a lot of material that we weren't really surfacing to the people, to developers in an evident way. For example, we were just using the log from the task that was running your test to provide a link to the BrowserStack session, and from the log you would see obviously the terminal log, so you would see the tests output, but this was generally not very clear, and it wasn't really too obvious. So we decided to create this dashboard, which puts together a good variety of these troubleshooting tools, and allows you to see the session, your test session. It allows you to see the error snapshot. So for example, if your test failed at a specific point, we store the DOM structure of it and also the screenshot. And for those, especially the DOM snapshot in this case, it's particularly useful because if, for example, if there is a failure due to an element that wasn't there, you can kind of see what the DOM structure was at the time of failure, and you can investigate further. There's also a link that we created between tests, commands, and videos, which is something that allows you to say that these failure that happened at, I don't know, minute 5 in your video is related to a specific test case in your Selenium tests, and it's also bound to a certain Selenium commands on BrowserStack or on the remote server. There's a lot more of these, so I just wanted to give some examples of troubleshooting tools or debugging tools, as we call them. There's also some more hidden features like automatically retrying a failing session when some type of failures happen. We don't believe in the retrying everything by default just because things could be flaky, because that generally leads to more instability of your tests, and it's generally one of the anti-patterns. So for a certain subset of those failures, we automatically retry the entire session. And this generally applies to things that are outside of the team's control, outside of your test, basically. So browser creation failures or other pieces of our infrastructure fail. For example, retrieving some credentials or getting a lease, credentials lease, or network blips or CDN failures, things like that. We get alerted by them, so we know that they're happening. And we also get alerted collectively for all of HubSpot. And at the same time, if that's outside of your hands, we don't want you to be, we don't want your work to be interrupted by them. And just jumping into the conclusions, basically just to share some numbers. In these 2.5 years of the team being at HubSpot, we've gone from about 3,000 tests per day to over 50,000 tests per day running across all of the apps and all of the teams. And this is a snapshot of the last month in terms of testing frequency. So we have some days there where we have more tests than other days. Obviously, it depends on how much you're deploying as well. But it's generally these have been really good indicators that the testing culture is growing and growing, and the mindset is spreading. And this is a breakdown of the successes versus failures. And finally, some wrapping up notes. So just to give some CTAs, I left some useful links at the end of these slides if you want to check them out. So we talk a little bit more about the front-end platform and the engineering values that we have and our components library if you want to see that. And just again, to wrap up, we just want to say that if you do have a testing infrastructure in place, that leads to higher productivity overall, because you're removing the burden of figuring out some details from your developers, and you can allow them to just focus on the bits that matter. So testing their own apps, testing your product, and making the product more reliable. Also, better tooling, providing tooling means happier engineers. And finally, obviously, all the tools in the world will not make your front-end testing as first-class citizen. You also need to develop the testing mindset. So documentation, best practices, support, all of that. And with that, I think I can hand it over to the Q&A session.
Awesome. Thanks, Lamberto. Great session. We have a good amount of questions lined up. Quick announcement, everyone, before we get into questions. There's a polite poll that's been fired. If you'd like help with your test setup, please answer yes.
All right.
Awesome. Let's get into questions. So I think there are a lot of questions around your team and the responsibilities of the teams. Are end-to-end tests written, maintained, and owned by developers or the testing team?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? There's a little blip.
Sorry about that. Are end-to-end, who owns the writing and maintenance of your end-to-end tests within the org?
So the writing of the end-to-end tests belongs to the engineers that are also writing the features. I forget to mention, we don't have a QA department, so every engineer is responsible for writing their own tests, and that was why the testing team was created. One of the reasons why. So we. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, we own the infrastructure bit of it. So if there is a problem with those tests, generally we would work with the specific teams to figure out what's the problem. And for everything regarding actually writing the tests, we provide best practices, but that's still a responsibility for everyone at HubSpot.
Got it. And who decides which of the test cases are automated? What's your automation acceptance criteria like?
So that is something that's generally up to the team to decide. So it can be a decision that's coming from the TL of the team, or a decision that's coming collectively as a team, or from the product manager. There are some more critical teams in the HubSpot org which have more inputs on this decision. For example, revenue and everything regarding those critical components of the HubSpot product. And for those, there's more stakeholders in place for the tests. But in the general case, it's up to the team to decide in some form. We really rely a lot on the autonomous bit of the small teams being autonomous and working together.
Does the Fast team perform code reviews with the autonomous teams?
That's the short answer is yes and no. We don't directly do code review for all of the other teams, because otherwise our life would just be doing that. And even so, 4 people wouldn't be enough to cover the 200 engineers that are writing automation tests almost every day. So we sometimes get pulled into some pull requests. We have like an on-call handle that people can use to tag us in there, and we have a look with a kind of a rotation within the team. But we don't jump on all of them.
I see. We had a couple of questions around your test reporting. Do you have custom reports for your tests? And is there a tool that you use to visualize those reports?
Yes, we. This is kind of covered by the what I call the acceptance test dashboard. So that's where the output of those tests is rendered in a sort of a report form. So you can see all of the individual test cases, and for each, how much it took, the video associated with it, the commands associated with it, the errors, eventual errors that were associated with it, and all of that. So the dashboard is the centralized place for all things reporting.
Got it. There's a question around how you let consumers know that you support the latest versions only.
That's something that we explicitly say in the canvas in our components library. It's one of the links that I shared at the end of the slides. There's a link to canvas.hubspot.com, which is it's a showcase of the components library that the UI components team builds over time, and the design practices, design guidelines that we use. And yeah, basically we use that to we use the Canvas website basically to say which browsers are the browsers that we support. So it's generally the latest version of the major ones, and IE is obviously special, so IE 11 is on a side. And this is regarding the HubSpot product. So when you're inside the HubSpot product and the testing of the HubSpot product, not the websites of our customers, let's say.
Mm-hmm. We have a question around failed test cases. What is the flakiness percent in your end-to-end test suites? How do you make a decision, a go or no-go decision based on the results as part of your CD cycle?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the percentage varies between teams. Overall, if we look at this slide, in one of the latest slides, there is a breakdown between success and failures in the last week, and that's probably the closest we can get to a percentage of the two. So it's around 5 to 10% failures across the board, and that varies a lot between teams, though. So there is something that we're working on a lot, is to minimize those false positives, and that is what the infra retries is for. In general, when you do have test failures, you have to go and check those failures before you can move on to the next stage. Now, there's obviously exceptions to that. For example, sometimes there are some critical situations, and you need to deploy a fix straight away. And some teams might be a little behind on reaching the 100% reliability of the test. Spoiler alert, 100% reliability doesn't really exist. So you're always going to have a certain degree of failures, right? But having a certain reliable threshold would be, it's something that not everyone has mastered yet. And we, even if it's been 2.5 years, we're still working towards that goal. And it's one of the main goals that we have. So ultimately, it depends on the team. It depends on the team is the answer to many questions, I reckon. But it's really how it works with the autonomous mindset that we have. But yeah, generally, teams would be looking into the failure before moving on to the next phase. And sometimes there is the retry approach, where retrying it and it passes, then it means, it most likely means it was a flaky test, and then we generally dig in and try to jump in to figure out why it was flaky.
There's a follow-up question to that. Does your team use custom IDs for more to select page elements more reliably?
Yep. This is actually one of the things I had to left out of the talk because I was running out of time. But I did have a slide about how we moved from suggesting classes to having specific custom IDs or data attributes, as we call them. We generally suggest people to do that because this way they're not tied to the visual aspect, so the CSS aspect of it, and B, we're also moving more towards styled components, which don't have classes at all, classes that you define. So for those, really, the data attributes is almost the only way forward. So overall, it really separates the purpose of those. It makes the purpose of those more obvious. You know that when you're refactoring code and you're changing some things in your component, you're gonna see that there is a data testing attribute. That means there's a test that's addressing that component or is relying on that attribute. So you want to be careful with it, and you want to be sure that you're not breaking the test, and you want to change the test accordingly. So there is at least three reasons for going that road.
Got it. So we have a lot of questions coming in, more than we have the time. But here, I'm gonna quickly. So there were a few questions around change management and getting management on board with creating a dedicated testing team. What was that process like? How did you help them understand the value of having that dedicated team?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm able to answer because that kind of it was more of a responsibility of the front-end platform leaders above my, let's say, above the individual teams in front-end platform. So the process kind of came organically from the fact that there were so many questions around testing, and no one really dared to no one really dared to know the answers to most of them. I'm not going to say the answers to all of them because we don't even have those answers to all of them. But generally, there was no defined ownership of that part of the stack. And that was very different from the other sides of the front-end platform. So the UI component side, the internationalization side, and all of the other aspects of the front end, they had dedicated support, and testing didn't. So it was lagging behind. And somehow the reason why we focus more on end-to-end testing is that unit testing was less of a problem. We received less and fewer of those questions around unit testing. It was more defined, and it was easier for developers to know how to troubleshoot those issues. So this was where we need to make an investment, the next investment in terms of front-end platform.
Got it. So we are out of time, but we have a lot of questions remaining, Lamberto. So
I'll be jumping into the chat and trying to answer some other of those. I'm also going to share my contacts for anyone who wants to ask further questions.
That would be awesome. I think there were also a few folks who wanted to dig deeper into your slides and some of the examples that you had shown. I think it would be great to have you in the chat. But thank you so much, Lamberto, for coming on board, sharing your journey, and talking about how you test at HubSpot. Guys, let's give it up for Lamberto.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. Thanks, everyone.